should we have a look at some creative cash flow strategies that you can utilize within your portfolio? Uh, so first up, I shared yesterday around lease options, for example, and I told you yesterday we were talking 11 different ways that you could buy property with little to no money down. But you can also sell properties via a lease option as well. The only difference here is instead of being the tenant purchaser, you're now being the seller to someone who is a tenant buyer. So how that would look, this is a really good example for someone who has overcapitalized. And I'll give you a really good example coming up on a real life scenario that I know of. I've given this situation to the students, whether they go in and do it or not, that's completely up to them, right? But essentially what you're doing is you're selling it to a tenant buyer. And the reason why we say a tenant buyer is because they are leasing it, remember, but they do have an almost ownership stake in it, or a control stake, if we remember from yesterday. So the reason why this works is because remember, you are the professional property investor. You are the one who is going to craft the negotiations to work in your favor. So yesterday, when you're buying via a lease option, you would craft it to work in your favor. When you're selling via a lease option, you would craft it to work in your favor. So the reason why this works is because if you're stuck with a property which is negatively geared, you could turn it around by actually selling it via a lease option. So they would pay you a deposit up front. Again, that deposit should be negotiated, but it should ideally be between that 30 to 50, maybe even 100, depending on how high the price of the property is at the end. But they're going to pay all your outgoings. So they're going to reimburse you for insurance. They're going to reimburse you for rates. They're going to pay all the monthly operating expenses. They're going to be the one who is actually out mowing the lawns, etc. Everything that you no longer have to do. The second side to it is they're going to pay you an above market rent because they've got an ownership stake in it. They would typically pay around about 10% above market rent, which means that should now hopefully increase the cash flow and remove you from being negative. So between those two things, the above market rent and them paying the outgoings. And then the third part is they actually pay above market price for the property should they choose to actually execute the option. So here's a really good example. This is, I've taken this from a scenario from one of our students, and this was my suggestion to him as to how he would turn it around. They were doing a trade. The market's changed. They've ended up overcapitalizing it. And now they've got $770,000 in a deal where the property's only worth $700,000. So if they were to sell the property, they would realize probably, a 17,000 minimum loss, which they're just not willing to do. So I've suggested to them, well, if you were to sell it on a 5-year lease option, so that is giving it a tenant buyer, putting in a tenant buyer with 5 years. Remember we said yesterday that you would have the purchase date and the purchase time frame. So we're saying $850,000 and a maximum of 5 years. But if they pay an $80,000 deposit, well, you've actually got your profit back immediately, meaning the rest of the property is just sitting there, right? Like almost who cares? You've made the profit. You can almost leave that 770 and the tenant buyer is going to look after everything. If the market rent was $600 per week, they would probably pay an extra 150-ish, so $750 per week, plus they're going to pay all the expenses associated with that property as well. So that's one strategy you can use if you've overcapitalized or you've got a property which has gone down in value that you can't sell in today's market without realizing a massive loss. Well, you could look at selling it via a lease option just through this very similar, easy strategy. in order to actually turn it positive again. And again, in this example, they would make that $80,000 profit paid into them via the form of deposit, and the 770, who cares? You're going to carry that for maybe 5 years or so. And in 5 years' time, they might realize the option and pay you out for the other 770. Or they might say, you know what, we're not going ahead, give you the property back. And in 5 years' time, if prices have gone up, you can then resell it on the market again. So I do think that is one strategy everybody who is in that situation where they've overcapitalized or they've got a negatively geared property which they can't sell because they're now in negative equity, that you can utilize in order to sell and turn it positive again. Another very good strategy I think many of you should be thinking about is tiny houses. As many of you know, I've lived in a tiny house. I've been chairman of the board. We've worked very intensively with government in order to make it clearer how it all works. And it's actually starting to happen. We're finally starting to see a number of councils making allowances for tiny houses in their long-term district plans as well. So there is part of the Building Act, there's something called Schedule 1, which allows you to build a one-story simple building, less than 30 square meters without requiring building code. And it's something that's typically allowed for with shared sleep outs, that type of thing. There can't be any kitchen or bathroom in it. It still needs to be built to code. You just don't require getting building code. And this is what one lady in Auckland did. Now, she was doing it from the charity aspect, where she built about 10 or so tiny houses. They're all simple, under 30 square meter buildings, so they don't require building consent. And then they just share a communal building where they share the ablutions, they have a shared kitchen, shared lounge, that type of thing. But because of this, if you were to adopt a similar strategy, this is in Auckland, and Auckland is one of the hardest councils when it comes to tiny houses. All she did, she had it classed as a boarding house. And instead of being a vertical boarding house, it's almost a horizontal flat boarding house where everyone has their own little tiny house, and then they share the common facilities. If you were to do a strategy like this, it's very, very cheap in order to build a sleep out like that. In fact, you can even hire cabins for $100 or so per week, and then just be on renting it. Or to build something like this, you can be doing that for 25 to 30,000 or so. And again, if you were to be able to get, again, depending on your area, in Auckland, minimum 250,000, you can start to see how that cash flow, that sort of yield adds up very, very quickly. You can also use it for infilling on vacant sections. There's been a new rule come through from government forced upon at least all the major cities. I can never get it right. Medium density, I think it's MDSR, medium density standard requirements, where many houses in the major cities, Rotorua included, you're now allowed to build up to 3 stories, 3 dwellings at 3 stories, which means you could actually put a tiny house on there because a tiny house is deemed as a dwelling. And therefore, for example, here's a really good example, right? This is where my particular tiny house was. If you can, no, you can't see my mouse. We were able to slot into literally a car park, and add extra density into an area that allowed for 3 dwellings, and therefore it increases rent and the return on that particular property. But because of those MDSR rules, you might now be able to put 2 additional dwellings on without having to even worry about the cost of building. And I'll touch on that in a minute. This was a vacant section down in Otaki near Wellington. One of my students bought it. They demolished the house. This was more a personal thing. They hadn't done a mentorship at this stage. They'd bought the section, and they were just happy to sit there empty, paying the expenses on it. And I was like, why don't you put a couple of tiny houses on it? So they put a couple of tiny houses on it, and they were able to get $100 per week just for the land. They did nothing. They provided nothing. It was literally just the land. and they were able to make an extra $200 per week, which meant they were now able to cash flow a vacant piece of land or a land bank. And you can see here that they were able to pretty much double the value of the property over those 5 years that they owned it, where they didn't have any additional expenses on just bare land, which is very rare. This is another one of my students. They're actually here right now. Nadine, do you want to tell us what you were able to do on your development property? Is Nadine still here?
Yeah, I am. We've got a house that's got on 2 acres, or 5 acres, sorry. And we got a wonderful lady, sorry, who's she was in a bus, so she provided her own electricity with solar. We hooked her up to the hose, and the bus is now in repairs. She's got a stationary cabin that she's rented. She's hooked into the garage for electricity, and we get $250 a week.
Perfect. So yeah, so this is your development. You're still going through resource consent, and literally just like almost the backyard, just hidden behind the garage, you were able to bring in someone renting the land off you for $250 per week and increase your cash flow.
Yep.
In fact, I think we worked out, it added about $11,000 per year to your revenue, didn't it?
Don't let that listen, I'm not sure. I can't remember. Sorry.
We'll go with yes. In fact, do I have the numbers? No, I don't. But yeah, so again, another fantastic way of looking at how you can utilize just bare land, especially on something expensive like a development, whilst they're still going through the resource consent, that side of things. And it's now, it's not going to make them rich or allow them to retire anytime soon, but at least it's eased the pressure. So how do you go about finding people who come with their own tiny house, their own house bus or whatever, and just rent the land off you, sometimes even without wanting electricity or water? There's a website out there, Tiny House Land Share. Here's a couple of screenshots that I took for Wellington. So literally all they're offering is just land. Somebody brings the tiny house, the house bus themselves. They park up, and these guys, as you can see, 160, 200, 175 per week. Those are really common rents that you could be getting in, what typically we see about 150 to even now up to 350 in somewhere like Auckland. Obviously, the price per week is going to change depending on if you're offering electricity, water. But if you've got rural blocks, if you've got farm blocks, people are looking for that as well. And I think this is the biggest opportunity that most property investors are missing out on. And again, if you're negatively geared by $200 per week, a really easy way to add that back into your portfolio. You could also do it where you actually buy the tiny house yourself, and you can't rent it out under the Tenancies Act because it's not a building. But again, coming back to a license to occupy, you can license it out. And if you own the tiny house and you own the land, you could now be renting it out for $350 to $400. Wendy, I spoke about her yesterday. She's now looking at doing this. She owns a lot of land down in Christchurch, and she's now looking at how can she get a number of tiny houses onto her different blocks, because she can buy them for $70,000 to $100,000 and rent them out for up to $400, $450 per week. If you wanted to go this route instead, Squirrel do actually offer tiny house finance. You can get $70,000 without even requiring a deposit. Interest rates are obviously a little bit more, and they are over 5 years, so you do need to take that into consideration, P&I. Or you could borrow up to $100,000 with a $30,000 deposit. Excellent strategy to be able to add instant cash flow back into your property. And as I say, I do think this strategy, tiny house land share, is something any one of you who has even a little bit of land should at least be investigating to get that back into your portfolio. Other options that are out there, spare assets you might own which aren't being utilized to their maximum. If you've got a garage, you can put that on, rent that out separately. I found a website, and just Google it, rent my garage out. There are platforms that will allow you to connect in and rent it out, much like Airbnb, but for long-term garage rentals. And this can be $180 per week. Car parks typically range $50 to $60 per week. So between tiny houses, renting out garages, renting out car parks, you could be adding a potential $400 or so back per week back into your portfolio. Another strategy you can utilize is through renovations. Renovating the property increases rent, therefore increases cash flow, but also adding what we might call luxury items. Talking to your tenant and saying, what would you like? What would you like us to do to add to the property? And if I was to do that, what would you be willing to pay for? What would you be willing to increase the rent by in order to do that? Something simple like a heat pump. Obviously, your house already has to be healthy home standard, but if they want additional heat pumps in and they're willing to pay an extra $20 per week for a heat pump, well, at $2,000 or so for a heat pump, that's going to pay for itself very quickly. And you're now going to be able to, achieve additional income, especially if you're leveraging property, if you're leveraging mortgage interest rates instead of just paying for it out as cash. Adding bathtubs, fences, something like that, allowing animals, they're all little things that people might be willing to pay